Hey everybody, it's Pastor Stephen here with another episode of Ask Anything, which is a video series we're doing where you can submit your questions about the Bible, theology, or the Christian life. And a couple of times a week, I'm going to post a video answering one of those questions. And today's question is a really interesting one. Here's a question that somebody submitted, and it's a question about the Sabbath. It says, Numbers 16, verses 32 through 36. In that passage, the Lord told Moses that the man must die for gathering wood on the Sabbath. Clearly, the fourth commandment was critical. So why don't Christians observe the Sabbath, that is the Saturday Sabbath, the seventh-day Sabbath, today? And a secondary question that's included here is, what is work? If we're supposed to cease from our work on the Sabbath, then what constitutes work? These are really great questions, and what these questions point to is this whole larger question of how should Christians observe the Sabbath today? What does it mean to obey the fourth commandment? The background for this, of course, is looking at the fourth commandment in the Ten Commandments, which is found in Exodus chapter 20, verses 8 through 10. And here's what those words say, just to remind you. In Exodus 20, it says, "Remember the Sabbath day to keep it holy. 6 days you shall labor and do all your work, but the seventh day is a Sabbath to the Lord your God. On it you shall not do any work, you or your son or your daughter or your male servant or your female servant or your livestock or the sojourner who is within your gates. For in 6 days the Lord made heaven and earth, the sea and all that is in them, and rested on the seventh day. Therefore the Lord blessed the Sabbath day and made it holy." Now I want you to notice a couple of things about the fourth commandment there. It's a command that's rooted in creation. It's rooted in the idea that just as God rested from creation on the seventh day, we too are to rest. And this is also, quite obviously, part of the Ten Commandments, which means it's pretty important. The Ten Commandments are sort of the heart of God's law, and so Christians today typically take the Ten Commandments very seriously as a pattern for our moral lives. So based upon that, one might think that the answer to this question is fairly simple. If the Sabbath is part of the Ten Commandments, then we need to obey the Sabbath just as it was interpreted in the Old Testament. But it's not quite that simple. There's a couple of different factors that make this question a very complicated one to try to sort through. First of all, it's not completely clear what category of law the fourth commandment fits into. There are three types of laws in the Old Testament. There are civil laws, which pertain to the nation of Israel in the Old Testament and governing their civil life. There are ceremonial laws, which largely pertain to the worship practices of Old Testament Israel. And then there are moral laws, which pertain to just right and wrong behavior in general. What we see in the whole Bible is that when we get to the New Testament, the civil laws and the ceremonial laws are no longer binding on God's people, but the moral law still applies. So the question is, which category of law does the fourth commandment fit into? Well, there's not a widespread agreement on that. Many people feel that it is a moral law, just like the rest of the Ten Commandments. But others have pointed to it and said, well, no, it actually has some aspects of being a ceremonial law or a civil law, or maybe it's some mixture of all three. And depending on how we answer that question, it has implications for how we understand the ongoing relevance in our lives today. So that's one level that makes this kind of a complicated question. But the other piece that makes this complicated is that when we look at the fourth commandment, the law about the Sabbath, in the New Testament, it becomes clear in the New Testament that there are several ways that this commandment is transformed after the coming of Jesus. And let me just mention three ways that this commandment is transformed in the New Testament. First of all, in the New Testament, very soon after the resurrection of Jesus, Christians moved from observing the Sabbath on the seventh day of the week to observing what became called the Lord's Day on the first day of the week and worshiping on the first day of the week rather than the seventh day of the week. So just to give you a couple of examples of this, in Acts chapter 20, verse 7, it says, "On the first day of the week, when we were gathered together to break bread, Paul talked with them." And this text describes the Christians gathering for worship on the first day of the week. Similarly, in 1 Corinthians 16, verses 1 and 2, Paul says, "Now concerning the collection for the saints, as I directed the churches of Galatia, so you also are to do. On the first day of every week, each of you is to put something aside and store it up." So this text describes them taking up offerings, probably in the context of worship, and once again, it's on the first day of the week. What these texts reveal is that very early on after the resurrection of the week, or after the resurrection of Jesus, the first day of the week became the primary day that was set aside for worship, not the seventh day of the week. Why is that? Well, the answer is because the first day, Sunday, was the day that Jesus rose from the dead, and that became an important day in the life of the church. In fact, it came to be referred to, even in the New Testament, as the Lord's Day. So, for instance, in Revelation chapter 1, it says in 1:10, "I was in the Spirit on the Lord's day, and I heard behind me a loud voice like a trumpet saying, 'Write what you see in a book and send it to the 7 churches.'" So we see an emphasis in the New Testament on the first day of the week, and this idea of the Lord's Day being the first day of the week. What's interesting in the New Testament is we see virtually no emphasis at all anymore on the traditional Sabbath, the 7th day of the week. All the focus has been shifted to the Lord's Day. So that's one way this commandment is sort of transformed. A second way that it's transformed when we get to the New Testament is that there's a sense in which the Sabbath pointed forward to Jesus and was fulfilled in Jesus. We know that many of the ceremonial laws in the Old Testament, in fact, all the ceremonial laws, pointed forward to Jesus. Laws like the sacrificial system pointed forward to the one great sacrifice of Christ. The priesthood pointed forward to the great high priest, Jesus Christ. And so all of these ceremonial laws pointed forward to Jesus, were fulfilled in Jesus, which is why in the New Testament, those laws are no longer binding on Christians. There's also a sense in which the Sabbath pointed forward to Jesus and was fulfilled in him. Hebrews chapter 4, verses 9 and 10 say, "So then there remains a Sabbath rest for the people of God. For whoever has entered God's rest also has rested from his works as God did from his." It's a really interesting couple of set of verses. It's saying that the Sabbath in the Old Testament was not the end-all, be-all. It actually pointed forward to a greater rest, the rest that we would have in Jesus Christ by finding salvation in him, and ultimately to the greater rest beyond that, the rest that believers would have in heaven. And so there's a sense in which the Sabbath pointed forward to the rest we would have in Jesus, according to the book of Hebrews, and found its fulfillment in him. And so that's another way this commandment is somewhat transformed in the New Testament. And then thirdly, one other way we can say that this commandment is transformed is that it's clear in the New Testament that there is some Christian freedom when it comes to how we practice the Sabbath. You can imagine in the early church that there were Jewish believers who had grown up practicing seventh-day Sabbath very strictly, and then there were Gentile believers who weren't accustomed to that practice. And in the early church, these groups had to figure out, okay, what should Christians be doing? What's interesting is that Paul, when he wrote about issues related to Sabbath, said there's some Christian freedom as to how they practice these things. So, for instance, in Colossians chapter 2, verses 16 and 17, Paul says, "Therefore, let no one pass judgment on you in questions of food and drink, or with regard to a festival or a new moon or a Sabbath. These are a shadow of the things to come, but the substance belongs to Christ." So notice there that Paul says the Sabbath pointed forward to Christ, but he also says that the Jewish and Gentile believers shouldn't pass judgment on one another when it comes to how they go about practicing those things. It seems to be there was some Christian freedom when it came to how they understood that. Similarly, in Romans chapter 14, Paul says in verse 5, he says, "One person esteems one day as better than another, while another esteems all days alike. Each one should be fully convinced in his own mind." Well, here again, Paul acknowledges there were differences. Some people felt that one day was holy. Probably he's referring to Sabbath here, where some people thought that the Sabbath day, the traditional Jewish Sabbath, was understood as a holy day that had to be set apart in certain ways, and other people felt, well, no, all days are holy to God, and therefore we don't see it that way. And what's interesting is Paul acknowledges there's a disagreement, and he doesn't take a side. He simply allows for Christian freedom when it comes to that. And so what's interesting is that in the New Testament, it's clear that there is some Christian freedom when it comes to how the Sabbath is practiced. That's not something you see when it comes to the other 9 commandments out of the 10 commandments. Those are strictly held up as unchanging laws that all of God's people should strive to obey. But when it comes to the Sabbath, it's put in a little different category in the New Testament. There's some Christian freedom as to how it can be understood. So just to kind of summarize here then, what we see is that it seems like at first the Sabbath may be very straightforward since it's part of the 10 Commandments. But there are some real complexities to how we should understand this because, number one, it's not clear exactly what type of law the Sabbath falls into. And secondly, there are several ways that it's transformed when we get to the New Testament. So that brings us to the practical question, which is, okay, we've got all this complexity. How should Christians go about observing this today? How do we observe the Sabbath? Are we obligated to observe the Sabbath? And if so, in what sense? There have been several different views and positions on this throughout the history of the church. And I'm going to mention 4 of them to you. The first 2 are 2 positions that I don't think are ones that have very good support and ones that I don't think have a very good basis. The second 2, I think, are much more sound and are much more commonly held by Christians, not only today, but throughout church history. So let me give you 2 that I don't think are very biblically sound, and then 2 that I think are much more practiced and much more biblically based as far as today goes. So option 1 is, we could look at the 4th commandment and we could say, well, we should observe the Sabbath just as it was done in the Old Testament. On the 7th day, on Saturday, just as the Jews did, just as they were commanded to do, so should we. That position is really a minority position in the history of the church. There have been very few Christian groups that have held that position. One example would be like the Seventh-day Adventists. They believe in a Saturday Sabbath. But that's a real minority position. It's not commonly practiced because it seems fairly clear in the New Testament that the New Testament church shifted to observing the Lord's Day, the first day of the week, not the 7th day of the week. A second option is to observe nothing at all. There are some Christians today who would not observe any kind of Sabbath and wouldn't say we're obligated to observe anything. They would argue that these commands are pointed to Christ and were fulfilled in Christ, and because of that, they no longer have any binding significance for Christians today. They might say, well, yeah, worship is important and rest is important, but as far as setting aside any particular days or times, that's not necessary. Again, I think this is a fairly problematic view because if the Sabbath command is part of the 10 Commandments, and it's the heart of God's law, then to suggest that it has no enduring significance for the lives of Christians today seems like not a great argument to make to me. And additionally, it's very clear in the New Testament that Christians did observe a day of the week that was very significant, the Lord's Day. And so to suggest that all days are alike and that we shouldn't give any thought to setting aside a day seems to me like not a good position to take. So these first 2 positions are, again, I don't think widely represented within Christianity, and I don't think have as good of a biblical basis. Number 1, observing the 7th day Sabbath, or following what would know as the Jewish Sabbath, and the second would be just observing nothing at all. So let me give you 2 other positions, and these 2 are much more commonly held. I would say these are the 2 positions most commonly held by Christians today in some form or another. So a third option is observing a Christian Sabbath. This is sometimes called observing the Lord's Day Sabbath. What this view argues is that Christians are still obligated to observe the Sabbath today, the fourth commandment, but that we observe the Sabbath not on the seventh day of the week, but on the first day of the week, on the Lord's Day. Basically, what this view argues is that the obligations of the fourth commandment have been transferred from the seventh day to the first day. This is basically the view that is taught in the Westminster Confession of Faith. And I'll just read you an excerpt from the Westminster Confession of Faith. It says, "The Sabbath is kept holy unto the Lord when men prepare their hearts for it, arrange for their daily affairs to be taken care of beforehand, rest the whole day from their own works and words, and from thoughts about their worldly activities and recreations, and take up the whole time in public and private worship in the duties of necessity and mercy." So notice, according to this view, that the Lord's Day is a Christian Sabbath. It's reserved almost exclusively for worship and rest. All other activities, all other secular activities, all other things that we might engage in are really off limits, and except for duties of necessity and mercy, as it says, and we're to rest from everything else. This is one of the historic views within Christianity, and particularly within Reformed Christianity, is this idea of observing a Christian Sabbath or the Lord's Day Sabbath. There's another option that's very commonly held within Christianity and in the history of the church. And this is what we might call not observing a Christian Sabbath, but just observing the Lord's Day. This view, much like the one I just described, emphasizes the importance of the Lord's Day, that we are to make sure that we are meeting with our church family on the Lord's Day, that we're engaging in worship on the Lord's Day. However, this view argues that since the Sabbath has been fulfilled in Christ, there is no longer a need to observe formally a Sabbath or to have a strict day of rest. So while we should worship on the Lord's Day, while we should engage in fellowship with our church family, we are not obligated to observe a strict Sabbath and cease from all of our other activities in a strict Old Testament sense. So again, both of these options, both the Christian Sabbath view and just the observing of the Lord's Day view, both place a high importance on the Lord's Day, but one sees it as a more formal Sabbath that has strict requirements of rest and ceasing from all other activities, and one sees it as simply observing the Lord's Day and not including all those same requirements. Those who have the just observing the Lord's Day view would have a variety of perspectives on what it looks like to observe the Lord's Day. So the question is, which view is correct? And I would say, as I said a few minutes ago, that these third and fourth views are the most biblically based and biblically sound, and both have good arguments in their favor. There has not been a consensus in Reformed Christianity, in Christianity in general, or even in Reformed Christianity, as to which view is the best view, which view is the right view. Personally, I lean more towards the Christian Sabbath view because I believe the fourth commandment is part of God's moral law, and therefore it still applies to Christians. And so I do tend towards the position where I would say that we should set aside the Lord's Day not only as a day of worship, but as a day of rest. Now, while I would say that, I would want to give some disclaimers to how we would understand that. I think we need to be careful how we define work. So many people immediately want to ask the question, well, if we are to rest on the Lord's Day, then what constitutes work? What kind of activities should or shouldn't I engage in? And I would say to some extent that's going to have to be a matter of personal conscience. There's going to have to be some Christian freedom here, because our temptation is to want to create a list of do's and don'ts. Here's the things you can do, and here's the things that you can't do. But as soon as you go down that path, it becomes very easy to embrace a kind of legalism. And in fact, that's exactly what the Pharisees were guilty of. The Pharisees criticized Jesus for, among other things, breaking the Sabbath. They had a list of do's and don'ts that they had created. They weren't part of God's word, but they had created a list of do's and don'ts of what constituted work. And according to their list, Jesus broke the rules, and so they accused him of breaking the Sabbath. But Jesus confronted them, and in Mark 2:27, he said, the Sabbath was made for man, not man for the Sabbath. So the Son of Man is Lord even of the Sabbath. See, what Jesus pointed out to them is that they had misunderstood the Sabbath. They'd flipped it on its head. They had made it into a day that had become burdensome rather than a day that was restorative. And Jesus said, you've misunderstood the Sabbath. I am the Lord of the Sabbath. It's a day that's meant to be restorative, not a day that is meant to be a list of burdensome do's and don'ts. That same error that the Pharisees made can easily happen today, where we turn it into a list of do's and don'ts. So while I would embrace a form of the Christian Sabbath view, I would say we need to be careful how we define work and not define that overly rigidly. The second thing I would say is we have to be careful how we define rest. Rest may look different depending upon what kind of work you do. I mean, if you are somebody who works a desk job and you're sitting at a computer all day long, then rest might look like taking a walk in the woods. On the other hand, if you're somebody who works in manual labor, or you're working construction or something that's really physically exhausting, rest might look like taking a long nap. And so we need to be careful, I think, how we define these things and allow for some Christian liberty when it comes to those things. So let me just give you a few concluding thoughts here. Number one, I think just an overarching general thought here as we bring this to a close. I think we need to be careful about judging other Christians who understand the Sabbath differently than we do. Clearly, Paul had the idea that Christians should have some mutual forbearance and not judge one another in terms of different views of the Sabbath, and we should too today. I told you my personal view, but I know there are some who have a little bit different understanding than I do as far as the instead of a Christian Sabbath view, they might have a Lord's Day observance view, and that's okay. I think we need to not pass judgment on one another. And in addition to that, some of the specifics with how we observe the Sabbath, like what we view as work or what constitutes rest, I think we need to allow for some Christian freedom on that as well, so that we're not lapsing into legalism. Regardless of what your view is, whether you hold more of the Christian Sabbath view or whether you hold the Lord's Day observance view, I think a couple of things are clear. One is that regardless of your view, we should all be committed to worshiping on the Lord's Day. It's clear that in the early church, Christians were committed to worshiping together on the first day of the week, which was called the Lord's Day, and they set that aside. Regardless of their different views on strict Sabbath keeping, they had that in common, and I believe that we should today as well. Hebrews 10:24 through 25 says, "Let us consider how to stir one another to love and good works, not neglecting to meet together, as is the habit of some, but encouraging one another, and all the more as you see the day drawing near." Hebrews says, don't neglect to meet with one another. We should set aside the Lord's Day for worship. And I believe that when people just skip church to go do other activities, I don't believe that is honoring to God. I just don't. Now, I understand there are some times when we're out of town on vacation, so we can't worship with our church family, or something comes up and we get sick and we can't go to church. All of that is understandable. There will be those Sundays when we can't make it to be with our church family. But on an ordinary Sunday, I do not believe that it honors God for us to be scheduling activities or skipping church to do other things. I think no matter what our view of the Sabbath is, that we should be committed to worshiping on the Lord's Day. And then the last thing I'll say is that I think no matter what our view is, we should strive to keep the Lord's Day a holy day. The fourth commandment says that God said to keep the Sabbath holy. Again, the Sabbath is transformed when we get to the New Testament, but I think the principle applies that we should seek to keep the Lord's Day holy. What does that mean? Well, it means that it should be set apart. It means that it should be a day that looks different. from the other days of our week. Not only should we be committed to worshiping with our church family, but there probably should be some activities that we would normally do on other days that we cease from doing, that we don't engage in, simply because we want to send the world a message and say that, hey, this day is set apart for us. This is a different day, and this is a day that belongs to our Lord. And so we are not going to engage in certain activities simply because we want to set it apart and we want to honor it as holy. Again, I don't want to get into a list of particular do's and don'ts. I think that's something that you need to pray about, and that should be somewhat a matter of Christian conscience. But I challenge you, if this is an issue that you are still not sure where you land, to study the scriptures some more. Look at the passages that I shared with you and take seriously the fourth commandment and how it is then transformed when we get to the New Testament. Because no matter what view we hold, I think there are some specific applications that we should embrace. And so I hope this has been helpful to you. Again, I encourage you to continue sending your questions to me for this video series. You can send them to askanything@highviewepc.org, and I'll look forward to being with you next time.